Hi, so this is a double act. Roger Curtis, me, building surveyor by trade, so not a formal archaeological background. I do work for Historic Environment Scotland, but I don't think I'm in today's Scotsman, although quite a few other people are, but we'll leave that right there. Thank you very much. I'm going to do the intro in the context to a project abbreviated to Towers of Rule, which gives a sort of situation and background and how we came upon various locations, some known about and some not known about, and then Kieran will go into the interesting bit of the digging and how it was all taken forward. So let's just say where it all came from then. So the project started in 2019 to complement the campaign for the Scottish Borders National Park application as a kind of cultural backup element to it. That didn't actually get off the ground in the end, but this sort of carried on, and really to research and understand the mid-16th century environment in Rulewater. As you probably know, the Scottish Borders is a big sort of identity with reaving and that sort of frontier activity. So for people's engagement, it was a good topic to aim for, and an element where we felt the history wasn't fully understood or appreciated, and even sort of the scope of the resource not really understood. Lots of support from local people, including the Ancram District Historical Society, and I think as we've seen today, wider links with the campaigns of the Marian period, the Henry VIII's invasions and raids. So there's a nice linkage there, although I'm very much into kind of micro detail. Quite a lot of staff support from Historic Environment Scotland, particularly Dave Cowley in what was Archam's team, who helped out with validation of some of this. So it wasn't just sort of me looking at something saying, isn't that great? Get Kieran to look at it. And then funding from Scottish Borders Council and others, including Society of Antiquaries, which allowed Archaeology Scotland to take the project forward. What are we looking for, as I said? Really elements, we were wanting to pick up on a certain strand, and the Earl of Hertford's raid on Teviotdale in the autumn of 1545 was sort of landed on as a good emblematic episode. There's reasonable records with it, and really what we wanted was physical remains of domestic and defensive structures from that period, as to give a bit of tangibility to the community and give a bit of anchor on this area of the Scottish Borders, where really there hasn't been much archaeology at all, and not a huge amount of history visible to us all beyond the hill forts at the top that you've heard a little bit about, and the 19th century steadings that really kind of dominate things. And also identify structures from the 1536 Act of Scottish Parliament Act, which obliged landowners and others to fortify and provide defence for their tenants, and it gave some quite specific instructions on what that should look like. And as a building surveyor, I loved it because it used the word 15 ells long by so-and-so wide with a height of this. So it was kind of specific, and there's just a couple of sniffs of where that might have been. And so what are we talking about, really? Bastils, enclosures, mottes and earthworks. Although what came out gradually was that perhaps an earlier bias from the 16th century period. But I'll let you judge that and as the evidence. So there's an image of Slacks Tower, scheduled monument, which Piers Dixon here today will be very, very familiar with, and a typology that I've developed an unhealthy interest in. And they have a nice commonality in this particular part of Scotland. So you kind of know what you're looking for if you think that this is all there is. And of course, there's a lot more than that. The research question that we're perhaps trying to ask is maybe a sniff of an answer to this thing in the red box there, where the Royal Commission survey in 56 talk about earthwork scale monuments, not up at the top as in the traditional hill forts element, but what's sometimes called scarp edge or promontory forts. And that definition is perhaps a bit wide, does not refer to things on the west of Ireland, but to stuff certainly in the Scottish Borders, where the geology and the topography gives you very steep edges on which you can build defensive structures if the time and the circumstance allows. And a good example of that will be described by Kieran later on. And can we get a better understanding of this particular typology, where this survey, I appreciate it's quite a while ago, really didn't think there was a quick answer. So getting dates to locations was an aspiration. Onto the 1545 raid itself. I've put a little flame mark there just to remind myself what this was, which was a highly destructive raid by a mercenary force, probably about 2,500 individuals, half of which were mounted as cavalry, half of which were foot soldiers. And they came up from Newcastle, I think, Berwick, and then split into separate parts. So we'll just deal with the Rulewater element. And then we've got a report by his secretary Paget, or to Henry VIII's secretary Paget, which refers to 11 or 12 places in Rulewater. And early in the project we called it 12 Towers of Rule. Well, there weren't 12, and they weren't towers, and some of them weren't even in Rulewater, but we'll pass on that because the name kind of stuck. And then you can see, move through Teviotdale, 11 places on Rule, and in red we've got pretty good feelings for where those are. Whether there's evidence there or not was part of the research question. The ones that stayed in black, a little bit of ambiguity as to where they actually are. So lots of sources, and I'll be quick here because we could lose time. If you want anything old in Scotland, of course, you always tap on the door of Timothy Pont and his excellent surveys. And the manuscript map of the borders is available, or this part of the borders is available, inverted and covered over with Dumfries, but you can actually digitally unpick that, as I did, which took a bit too much time. But it gives you a good steer on where to go, which the printed one, which I'll show you, loses a couple of settlements. Later work, Gordon's, and then Schenk, Jeffrey's Antiquities, Ordnance Survey Name Book mentioned a couple of times, really useful resource. Tancred, Rulewater and its people, and all of those gave really good little mentions of things, but they weren't terribly consistent. So there were many patches and gaps, but if you merge it together, you start to get perhaps a picture of where to start to look. And of course, our old friend Canmore from Past Map, now in a bit of digital upgrade, but I'm sure we'll come through that. But that was a real present. And I didn't mention LiDAR in here, but I should have done, which came in available a little bit through the project, but absolute godsend, and I'd be still on a hillside without it. So the area we're talking about is Rulewater between Hawick and Jedburgh. This is the published version by Blau a few years after the survey itself, and the ringed area is more or less covering the area we're thinking about. The actual raid, and I'm afraid I don't have any laser target designation available, but the actual raid did not get very far up Rulewater. So when Hertford knighted all these brave people for burning and destroying innocent civilians, they didn't even get the full part of the mission. So anyway, and the names there are interesting because there's a continuity in place name is very, very distinctive in this part, or certainly that's what I noticed, and allowed quite interesting alignments with what is there now and what might have been there before. Places do wander a little, but they quite often designate themselves by nether, easter, wester, or lower upper, so you kind of get a sniff as to where it came from. How are we for time? Good, right. So that's what we're sort of looking at, and then you can see my GIS incompetence that I had to go for the 1947 Ordnance Survey, but it has a clarity. So the red circles are the sites that we reckon were burnt in the raid, and part of the early naive aspirations of the project that we'd go to these places and we'd find charcoal and skeletons and helmets and things. And of course, quickly that wasn't the case because the lower part of Rulewater is more agriculturally dense, more improvement, less remains. The green dots go much further up to the northern part of Rulewater into areas that are not part of the raid but have antiquity and significance or some form of age to them, and where we actually found quite new and interesting remains of structures that then Archaeology Scotland could get an actual look at. And the sort of amber, orangey ones are where there is evidence cartographically and through history for something being there, but due to later development, that has been overwritten. So specifically, Hall of Rule, and Fodley, brilliant site, nicely on the edge, but recovered over by later steadings and other activity. And I'll pick up on one particular one to sing the benefits of Timothy Pont. He may not be accurate geographically, but relative to each other, that gives you a steer. So very specifically, this one, which I'll talk about, which is Tour of Rule, is halfway between two sites that he records. And this is open agricultural ploughed ground. So it's, if it's there, you'll see it. And of course, quite heavy agricultural activity, which was described earlier. I thought, what's going to be there? But dialogue with the guy who farms it revealed something which I'll come on in a second. Anyway, I've covered a bit of this, so I think in the interest of time, I'll keep light on it. But essentially 27 new sites, which are pretty dead certs of various flavours of interest, are there, checking on the ground, a bit of site validation and checking with other parties, including Kieran, who got his feet quite wet and tired. Only 3 really would align with the raid. So that raid sort of alignment task early on in the project kind of died away because we wouldn't really, might have an awful lot to say or show you. But a few notable new ones, particularly Tour of Rule, I touched on. Abbot Rule, probably from before this period. Interesting thing. Swanshield Clue, you'll hear about. Forburn, and an interesting new typology of mill stuff that I'll perhaps touch on, and some of you may have more knowledge than I. And we got it onto Canmore in 2024, so good thing there. So just to give a flavour of what we're talking about then, our friend LiDAR, and again, Richard Strathy, sadly no longer with us, was able to process this stuff before it became available on the National Library of Scotland website, and it indicated earthwork-type features that you can see here on the map already, but aligns very closely with what was called the Woolies, and a very poor image of the conifers growing up. They'll be about 3 or 4 times the height now, archaeologically difficult to get into, and a very chopped up site, as you can see. What we're really talking about is this earthwork and ditch here, cut in half by a later 19th century mansion house garden. So, kind of defaced and chewed up. Are we going to find much there? Don't know. Didn't like the trees, so we found an easier target, frankly. Or we thought we'd get on better. An interesting one here, described as crossview in the report, possibly this location here, and a nice plaque up is that the farm where I was asking about, they said, oh yeah, that field is Courses Clue. So you've got that sort of verbal pass on. It's not written down anywhere. This is just verbal handover, which has a certain charm. How accurate it is, you can perhaps comment on. The site itself, kind of steep in places, lots of masonry lying around. Is that plough stones chucked over? Don't know. But it's a nice alignment with that linguistic evidence and potentially a little bit more. The bank around it is almost definitely later as a result of ploughing and other things. A couple of big sites appeared, and again, this is courtesy of LiDAR because this is in a close, in a forested area, and if you like veteran oak trees, this is the place for you. But there are also significant banks, and much earlier origin possibly than the medieval period we're talking about, maybe later reuse. Those with better LiDAR eyes than me might see there's something to look at there. But a lot of activity here, probably a lot of later quarrying and all sorts. This is not on any record at all. There's a legacy wall top on top of this very substantial bank going down to the left here. And I thought, oh, masonry in situ. But in fact, that's perhaps a later, maybe a field boundary or wood enclosure or something. And is that one of the Fulton ones? And you can see I put the little flame on it to suggest that. There is a tower house quite close by, but that's almost definitely about 1590. The architecture of that is very much in a later period and possibly not part of the raid. This is perhaps an interesting one. Reuse of earlier features and sites with the longer occupation periods. This is the one I mentioned in between the big fields with the arable ground. And I was talking about it over the kitchen table and said, what's there? And he said, oh, my grandfather ploughed that bit out, so that won't be it. I went, oh, it's not looking very good. And then he said, the badgers. So interestingly, this is the road from Bonchester to Jedburgh, Slaterford Bridge, where the panel on that bridge says the Battle of Slaterford and we beat the English and whatever, all good stuff. What they're really talking about is the ford, and that's the Rulewater going across, and the ford is actually here. So already you've got a bit of movement of the story. And then you have this lump here, and this I actually got to this before LiDAR, so this was a sort of Mark I eyeball stuff with a bit of human intelligence. And the image on the right shows you very rectangular, modified natural feature, absolutely looks like something decent. So maybe an opportunity there. Unfortunately, it's a very significant hotel for badgers. And what they've not done is thrown up any archaeology to the surface. It is it is clear. But what is there is a lot of what we who do construction with masonry call ugly stones. These are big bits of whin that you can't break up. They're too big to move. And when you've cleared the site of anything useful to build your steading, you leave those behind. So there's indicators and traces. No lime mortar found. This is all clay potentially. But anyway, lots of discussions and considerations. So that's a nice one. And then to wrap up my list very shortly is Abbot Rule. So this is a very historic site mentioned in charters. Canons of Jedburgh ran it as one of their franchises possibly. This again was a pre-LiDAR site. The person who farms that said, look, come and have a look at this please. And you can see this earthwork feature. So this is the burn coming down from the 19th century farm of Walton Head, comes down here, and then you've got this very substantial ditch that cuts off this little heading. Suggestions that this was much bigger once upon a time. Very flat and clear inside, but two features which show in the photograph on the right-hand side, which has been suggested this could be of a medieval date with a timber palisade around it and that sort of thing. Our metal detector friends have been busy in the field over here, and there has been anecdotal evidence of silver coins of that period. So these are the kind of sites that we got indications of, and then discussion with Archaeology Scotland as to where to go next, and then Swanshield, which you'll hear a little bit more about. I hope you're getting a feeling for the typology of something that sits on the edge of these very steep clues. And if you're worried about cavalry and people raiding from wherever, that's a good place to be. Suggestion of an earlier feature maybe, but certainly what you'll hear about is perhaps the thing on the edge. Hard to photograph because of trees and things, but Kieran will give you a little bit more detail on that. And finally, where LiDAR could not see because it's got a few gaps, this aerial photograph indicated a potential feature here. That's what it looks like on the ground, and some nice basalt-typey stones lying around, which gets me going as a masonry building guy. I think I'm going to stop there. There's a reconstruction of Slackstow, but we don't have time for that. So I think, Kieran, that's for you now. So Kieran will now go into the actual reality of looking at this stuff on the ground and all the community work and the people that got involved.
Thank you very much, Roger.